Hi, welcome to another one of my teaching videos. We're still in the beginnings of Christianity, looking at some of the groups who we no longer hear of. And most Christians have, unless they've studied the history of their church recently, have never heard of. So today it's Montanism. Now, you may see Montanism called the Phrygian heresy or New Prophecy. It was a movement started by a man named Montanus, and it arose in the Christian church in Phrygia in Asia Minor in the 2nd century AD. And it flourished in the West, principally in Carthage, under the leadership of Tertullian, who we spoke of before as one of those people writing against heresy. It almost died out in the 5th and 6th centuries. More about that later, but there's some evidence that it survived into the 9th century. And I also want to speak about some things happening today. The Montanist writings, of course, have perished. Only brief references to them by their critics, of course. And the chief sources for the history of the movement are Eusebius, who wrote Ecclesiastical History, and the writings of Tertullian and Epiphanius, who we've mentioned before, and inscriptions, especially in central Phrygia, where it was most popular. Well, what happened in about the year 156? A recent convert to Christianity named Montanus was at the church in a small village there when he fell into a trance and he began to prophesy under the influence of the Spirit. Now, in other references to Montanus, it also mentions, and so some people believe this also happened, that he spoke strange words and then later explained them. And that would probably be a reference to glossolalia, or the speaking in tongues that Paul, the apostle, speaks of in his book of 1 Corinthians and other places. But anyway, he began to prophesy. And this happened more than once. So he was soon joined by two young women, Prisca, sometimes called Priscilla, and Maximilia, who also began to prophesy. And the movement spread throughout the area. And inscriptions in a number of towns in that area of Asia Minor indicate that these towns almost completely converted to Montanism. Well, the essential principle was that the paraclete, that's another word for the Spirit of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth that Jesus had promised, according to the Gospel of John, was manifesting itself in the world through Montanus and the prophets and prophetesses who followed him. And at first, this didn't seem to be any kind of an attack upon the church, because Paul recognized prophecy as a legitimate gift to the church. And other what we call the charismatic gifts, charismas to the church, prophecy, tongues, interpretation, These were all recognized in the earliest church. But it soon became clear that Montanist prophecy was new, and that's why it's sometimes called the new prophecy. The true prophets, the bishops believed, didn't induce a kind of ecstatic utterance where they couldn't control themselves, or they seemed to be taken over by the Spirit, and claimed that it was the voice of Spirit that spoke through them. And it also became clear that Montanists believed that through this vehicle of prophecy, we could add to the teachings of Christ and the apostles, and therefore the church hadn't received its full revelation. There was more to come, and it would come through him. Now, another important aspect of Montanism was their emphasis on the second coming of Christ, which was believed to be imminent. So it gave their meetings apparently the flavor of what we would see in a modern day revival service. They believed that the heavenly Jerusalem was soon to descend on the earth, but it was going to descend in a plain between two villages, Pepouza and Tyminian, both in Phrygia, because the prophets and the followers were there. And many of the Christian communities in that area had been abandoned. So, in addition to being very enthusiastic, they were also extremely rigorous. The time of fasting was lengthened. Some say they had as many as 3 seasons of Lent. Followers were forbidden to flee from martyrdom. Marriage was discouraged, and second marriages, if you were a widow or widower, were prohibited completely. Well, in probably in 177, the Catholic bishops decided this was too different from mainstream Catholicism to be tolerated, and they declared it heretical. So then it became a separate sect, and its seat of government, its central headquarters, was in Pepouza. It maintained the ordinary Christian ministry, but imposed on it higher orders of patriarchs and associates who were probably successors to the first Montanist prophets. Well, it continued in the East until around 560, but some remnants eventually survived to the 9th century. Another problem with Montanism was the allowing of women to hold positions of authority in the church. And of course, the Orthodox Church was totally male dominated. The earliest record of any knowledge of Montanism in the West dates from the year 177. And we know that there was a group of Montanists right in Rome. But most of them settled in Carthage, in Africa, and the sect became extremely important there. It is interesting that many scholars believe that Tertullian not only approved of the teachings of Montanists, but actually converted to that sect. And it's noted that he became interested in Montanism in the year 206 and actually left the Catholic Church between 212 and 213. But you need to know this is disputed by the Roman Catholic Church. He liked it because being pretty much of a rigorous person, very disciplined himself, he supported that. He saw the Catholic bishops as being morally lax. Well, Montanism has, of course, died out, been lost, but you are certainly probably aware that in today's churches, um, starting at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, has been something called the Pentecostal movement. And that movement, while it concentrates a good deal upon the gift of glossolalia, speaking in tongues, has been a revival of the other gifts listed in 1 Corinthians by the Apostle Paul, including prophecy. And then in about the 1960s, mid 20th century, this spread from small, what were considered undereducated groups into mainstream Christianity in what was called the charismatic movement. And there were great similarities between the charismatic, the Pentecostal movements, and the movement of Montanism in the 2nd century. So we'll revisit Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement much later in the history of church thought. Well, this is another of those groups that was declared by the proto-Orthodox to be heretical. What do you think of the teachings of Montanus and their various emphases? Let me know in the comments. I'd like to hear about that. Have a good one. I'll be back again, and pretty soon we'll be talking about some Gnostic teachers and learn what they had to say.